Hello, tea friends. As new teas continue to roll into the Light Meets Life fundraiser and go up for sale on our website, we want to continue to make videos anytime those teas are launching grounds for anything educational so that we can learn together. You can learn about tea, but you also learn through drinking tea. So it's really magical when a lesson combines with an experience and you can grasp something intellectually, but also grasp it experientially. And these two teas actually, which we're going to be selling in a set, were literally chosen for their educational value. So they were intentionally chosen as teaching tools. The first tea is actually the tea of the month for October. It's a Purple Sky replica. So all of you will be drinking this tea in October because it's coming along with the magazine. This replica is from 99, 2000. It's from around that time. You may notice that there's a lot of replicas on our website. We're not really interested in them because they're replicas. We're interested in them because of their cost to quality ratio. So as the Puer boom started happening at the beginning of the newborn era, there are 4 eras of Puer, right? Before 1949, we call the antique era. 1949 to 1972 is the masterpiece era. 1972 to 98 is the Chizabing era, and 98 to present is called the newborn era. These eras are described in greater detail throughout many issues of Global Tea magazine, so you can go search and read more articles about it. As the newborn era was beginning, Puer fandom, Puer love, and was starting to grow, and the boom was starting to happen. And so a lot of replicas started being made. And they were made for all kinds of reasons. You have replicas that were made out of love. So Puer lovers were trying their hand at blending the classic blends, which was something they couldn't have done. Like literally geography and politics and other things would have gotten in the way. But as like travel opened up and more Taiwanese Puer lovers and Hong Kong Puer lovers started to go to Yunnan, press their own cakes, they wanted to try to blend the aged classic blends that they had been drinking their whole lives. So you had some like passionate ones. We have a red mark on our website, for example, that is that is an attempt by a Puer lover to replicate the classic blend from the masterpiece era of red mark. There actually were red marks, but anyway, it was that person's attempt to do that. So you had some of that. And then you also just had like cash grabbing. You had people who were just trying to cash in on the reputation of these aged teas because it was really aged Puer that had spurred the boom. Aged Puer is magical. It's maybe the most magical type of tea on earth and amongst the best quality. Certainly the most expensive teas in the world are all aged Puers. So you had also this kind of cash grab. People are just making replicas to cash in on the fame of the cakes of yesteryear. And then, you also maybe had some people making them to sell as fake antiques, though that there is a lot of dishonesty in the tea industry and in the Puer industry, but that particular scam is not really that widespread. Simply because if you're selling a brand new tea as though it's like 20 years old, you're only going to be able to get away with doing that to someone who's very much a beginner. And eventually that beginner is going to get a hold of some real aged Puer and realize that they've been tricked and you're going to be called out. So it's not a very useful scam, and it's not very lasting, and it's just not that widespread, but it is possible that was one of the reasons as well. But as I said, we're not interested in these replicas because of that. The reason we like them is because this era of making a lot of replicas from like 98, 99, 2000, 2001, there was a lot in that time. Of course, they've continued even to the present, but that time there was a lot of them. And they tried to kind of make this similar blends, and they used good quality raw material. At that time, almost all of Yunnan was really clean. So there was a lot less pesticide use. Puer tea was very inexpensive, and so farmers didn't have money for agrochemicals. And so agrochemical usage really began in earnest I wouldn't call this a hard line, but there's kind of a line in my experience of around 2004. After 2004 is when, in my life anyway, I started to have to be a little bit more conscious in terms of agrochemicals in my Puer tea. So they're cleaner teas, and they're often, because they're replicas now, they're very cheap. And so you get a really good cost to quality ratio, which is why we're interested in them. So it really doesn't matter that it is a replica. In the issue, I go into Purple Sky and the history of Purple Sky. They're called Purple Sky cakes because they have this stamp on them that literally is the word sky, and the stamp is purple. This one actually isn't a stamp because it's a replica. It's actually been printed onto the wrapper. So it looks like a stamp, but it's actually been printed on. The original Purple Sky cakes are basically 8582 and 8592. There's also loose leaf Purple Sky, but the most famous Purple Sky, the Purple Sky, is a particular type of 8582. Though there are 8582, 8592, and some loose leaf teas that have the Purple Sky stamp, and so technically they're all Purple Sky. Basically, there was a Hong Kong merchant. The company's called the Nantian Trading Company. The man's name Mr. Zhou, a very famous dude in tea. And there's a lot that goes into this. There's economics that are involved because in those days they graded leaves from 1 to 9. And this was based on the size of the leaves, the maturity of the leaves on the tree. And so the higher the grade, the bigger the leaf, basically. And so the last number in the factory codes, the first two numbers are the year the recipe began, not the age of the tea, but the year that blend was begun. These factory codes originally were internal. In fact, the average poor consumer back in the day wouldn't have known them. Only like deep aficionados would have known them. But now they're famous and they're kind of out. But so the first numbers are the years that the blend began. And then the third number, that's the grade of the leaves. And then the final number represents which factory. In those days, there were so few factories that they only needed a single digit to distinguish. 2 is Monghai factory. So the Nantian Trading Company, he basically purchased up all the higher grades from 7 to 9 for his own use because they were cheaper, but also because he was a Puer lover and a businessman. So the businessman, the economics was that those leaves were cheaper. Those were lower grades. There's less buds. But also he noticed that the antique era cakes that he had grown up with, the cakes from before 1949, all had more mature leaves. So he decided that he wanted to kind of get back to, he wanted leaves from, if possible, from older trees, and he wanted more mature leaves in his blends to kind of get back to what cakes were like in the antique era. And so thus was born 8582 and 8592. In those days, that's the Cheats of Bing era, and all cakes, no matter what they were, they all had the wrapper of the CNMP that looks like this. And so Mr. Zhou in Hong Kong didn't really have a way to distinguish his cakes from other cakes on the market in Hong Kong. So he went to Yunnan and discussed it with the factory with Monghai, and they came up with the idea of putting this Purple Sky stamp, and the Tian is also in the name of his company. So they put Purple Sky and on all of his 8582s and 8592s, I believe, starting in like 88. And but the most famous Purple Sky cake is an 8582 from around that time, from 1988, 89. And so this is a replica of that famous cake. But again, we didn't choose it because it was a replica. We chose it in this instance because it's wet stored. So this lesson really isn't about the history of Purple Sky. I just threw that in as an anecdote so you could have a little bit more tea wisdom. That is all. There's a deeper version of that in the magazine as well. But the real reason we chose this is because it's wet stored. So what that means is that it is stored with more humidity. And all Puer storage really was, traditional Puer storage was all wet. It just means keeping it in a place where the humidity is higher. That could be intentional. So like renting a building that were in a particular part of the city or near the sea or whatever that has higher humidity to speed up fermentation, or a room that speeds up fermentation. But wet storage can also just mean storing it in a place like Hong Kong, or there's different parts of Taiwan, right? Like Taichung, for example, is a lot wetter than Miaoli. So if you keep pu'er tea in Taichung, it will be wet stored pu'er tea. And so wet storage is really a spectrum. And the words wet and dry stored, first of all, these are very new terms. Pu'er tea wasn't so intentionally stored back in the day. I can remember very early on, I think it was 99 or 2000, I went to Hong Kong to interview this man who's very famous. He's like a third generation Puer storer, basically a Puer merchant. His family's been, aging and selling Puer tea both to restaurants and dim sum and also to Puer lovers for a long time. And I wanted to know, like, how do you store Puer tea, right? And I remember I was there and I was really excited, so excited for this interview and meeting this famous person. And we drank antique era tea together. And, it was a real honor to meet him. And then I asked him, how do you store Puer tea? And he kind of looked at me like I was silly. And then I asked again and then again. And I thought maybe my Chinese is not good. My Chinese was a lot worse back in that day. Unfortunately, I had a translator with me because I was there on behalf of a magazine. So I asked her, could you ask him? And so she asked him, and then he finally, he was smoking, he stubbed out his cigarette, and he gave me the googly eye, and he said, I rent a room, and I put Puer tea in it. And then he changed the subject. And I was blown away. And it actually taught me a really important lesson, which was that back in the day, Puer was very, very cheap. If you go back far enough, we're talking cents. So you just rented a room and put it in there. There wasn't like you weren't geeking out. The geeking out was caused by two factors. First of all, a deepening of appreciation for Puer, right? So as the Taiwanese got interested in Puer in the early 80s, they started writing books about it. They started getting interested in the history, and this whole connoisseurship bloomed. That connoisseurship was there in Hong Kong and going back even hundreds of years, but small scale. It started to become bigger and started to bloom. And so there's a real, kind of just geeking out. But then you also have added to that the rising cost of Puer. If you come up to like now where it's hundreds of dollars for a cake, of course you want to, if something costs cents, yeah, you just put it in a room. But if it costs hundreds of dollars per cake and you're investing thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, you're certainly going to want to store it like as best you can, and you want to dial in as much as you can. So now, big storage rooms, like we have a friend in Taipei has one that's like got automatic doors and automatic humidity, and they're putting charcoal and they're cleaning, and everything's done, with a lot more intention. And so that also means that tea will be more expensive because it costs more to age it. But basically, back in the day, all tea was really wet stored. Even this idea of using this language of wet versus dry stored is very new in Puer connoisseurship, new as in the last 20 or so years. They say the first dry stored cake, which wasn't even noticed, or at least didn't come into wide scale appreciation, was in the people started talking a lot about it in the early 2000s, maybe mid aughts, and it's called the Baba Qingbing. It's an 1988 cake that a Puer vendor in Hong Kong, he ran out of space in his warehouse, and so he built a flying shelf, basically a shelf hanging from the ceiling, and he put this cake on it. And in big rooms, even in this small room, you can have a difference of humidity of 3 to 5% from the floor to the ceiling. And so in a bigger warehouse, it can be even more. And so that tea was a lot drier than all of the other tea. And so the fermentation slows down. And so that became the famous dry stored tea, and was a lot of that was marketing to sell it as well. The other thing that happened is Puer tea started being stored in places like Kunming and Beijing that are very dry and not traditional or even ideal places to store Puer tea. And so that tea started to become very dry. And that tea is extremely dry. I can remember one time in the early 2000s, we had a tasting of Red Mark, of a masterpiece era Red Mark, a 1950s cake that was given for free, basically, to promote this magazine. and I was there, and they served Red Mark. In those days, Red Mark wasn't as crazy expensive as it is now, so it was shared promotionally at this group of like 100 people. And the particular cake that we were sharing on that day, first of all, it was a great day. It was Tuji. It was one of the like better of the Red Marks. And second of all, the storage on it was impeccable. It was really on a scale of all Puer, it was dry, but it was like just perfect, not too wet, not too dry, but it was on the dry side, but really, really centered and very clean storage. And I can remember a couple of the guys at my table were like Kunming Puer vendors from the Kunming market, been in the Puer business like 5 years and opened a shop in the boom. And all they'd ever drunk really was Kunming tea. And they didn't really like it. To them, it was very wet. In fact, I bumped into them a couple of days later at the market, and they invited me into their shop, and they literally sat me down and they were like, we didn't like that Red Mark. That's not good aged tea. This is good aged tea. And they brewed it like a 7-year-old show Puer for me, which, to them, it's their prerogative. They like that better than the Masterpiece era cake. That's great for them. They get to save a ton of money. But my point isn't really to pick on them. I personally would much rather drink the Red Mark. But my point isn't to pick on them. My point is just that, dry and wet is a relative term, and, dry compared to what? Wet compared to what? It's really, these words are used very ambiguously, and how people use them depends on who they are. So what is dry in Kunming and what is wet in Kunming isn't what is wet and dry in Taiwan or what is wet and dry in Hong Kong. And the fact is, if you don't like the mustiness that comes from storing Puer tea in the places where it's traditionally stored, which is Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Taiwan, chances are you aren't going to like the genre of aged Puer very much, because very few well-aged teas are stored impeccably in the sense that they don't have some wet storage. That's just a fact. Certainly there's a line after which wet storage is not pleasant. Tea can get moldy, it can be very musty, like dirty laundry or something. My tolerance for it's pretty high. I like musky tea. This particular Purple Sky is not very heavy wet stored, but it's certainly wet stored. And that's why we chose it for this month's tea. We wanted you to try a wet stored Puer, a 20-year-old wet stored Puer. This certainly has some wet storage. And then we wanted to find a cake that was very dry so that we can sell both the cakes. So if you want to get a whole cake of each, you can. But we're also going to sell a set of packets of a dry stored and a wet stored tea. And so the dry stored tea, we're calling the Crane because it's a Shaguan 2001 Shaguan iron discus cake. And the iron discus means that it was compressed very, very tightly with a machine, and a unique type of machine actually. And so it has all those perforations on the back, and you can see the side of it's flat, unlike a lot of Puer cakes that you may know. The sides of this are flat. So this 2001 Shaguan iron discus, and that real tight compression slows down fermentation. But this tea also, from birth, from 2001 until now, it has been stored on the 4th floor in a warehouse that's on the 4th floor. That's a very dry warehouse. It's one of these modern warehouses that I talked about that is kind of engineered to store Puer tea in a very high-tech way. And so its whole life, it's been in a very, very dry, clean environment, and it's tight. So both of those factors make it pretty dry. Is it as dry as this same cake if it was stored in Kunming? No. But to me, like those, a lot of those places, if it gets that dry, again, that's like the line on the too wet. Too wet, like so musky and moldy, is no good, but too dry, and all the microbes die and the tea dies out, I had a tea that was very wet stored, covered in mold. There are many types of mold, actually. Some molds are bad. You have to throw the tea away. If it's blue, green, if it's yellow, black, any kind of weird mold, I would throw it away. If you're scared, throw it away. But white can be okay, a certain type of white mold that gathers on fruit here in Taiwan. And I once found a really wet tea, and it was super cheap, and the dude gave me half of it, and I just wanted to play. I didn't really want the tea, but I bought it just to play. And I took it home, and I gave it about 6 years in a really dry space. I brushed all the mold off, gave it 6 years in a dry space, and it turned out okay. Whereas literally the worst puers I've ever had in terms of aged puer. The worst puers that I've ever had are ones that were too dry and so dead and like puckery and nasty or flat. So given the extremes, I personally would take too wet, though I'd rather not either of these. Somewhere in between. So again, this is all relative. Those dudes in Kunming, they might not say this is as dry as I would say. To me, this is a very dry stored tea, and I think you'll be able to see that. And so if you buy this set, no matter what approach you're coming from, if you're used to drinking Kunming teas, or if you're used to drinking Taiwanese teas, or if you're used to drinking Hong Kong teas, if you're used to drinking those different types of teas, you'll have a different idea of what wet or dry is. What's wet and what's dry to someone who lives in Hong Kong is very different than what's wet or dry to someone who lives in Kunming. However, certainly this Shaguan cake is much more dry stored than this Purple Sky cake. That's a fact. So wherever you fall on that scale, these two are pretty far apart. In terms of Taiwan, they're about as far apart as you can get without damaging the tea, without crossing that line on the dry side or crossing that line on the wet side. These are about as far as you can get. This one's about as wet as you can get and still have a good quality tea. This one's about as dry as you can get and still have a good quality age. So they're both aged, well aged. They're aged nice for what they are, but they're also far apart on the spectrum. And the farther things are apart on the spectrum in tea, whatever it is, the easier it is to learn that lesson. So if you're really trying to learn about storage, teas that are stored really close to each other and the difference is very subtle, that will be very hard for you to learn. But if they're far apart on the spectrum, you'll be able to learn very easily. So if you want to learn about puer storage and what happens when there's higher or lower humidity, this is about the greatest extremes that we can offer you. If we maybe search high and low, we might be able to find a slightly better example, but for the most part, this is the best we can do to get to the two extremes in terms of tea stored in Taiwan, and you'll be able to have a tea that's about as wet as we like without damaging the tea. It's still good quality tea, and about as dry as we like without damaging the tea, and it's still good quality tea. So this Purple Sky is really more how I like my puer. I like it a little bit on the wet side. I like it a little bit wet stored. You can correct this if you want by aging it for some years in a little slightly drier environment. And this one's pretty dry. You'll notice also that this one's a lot more expensive than this one, which highlights what I started out by saying, which is why we're interested in these replicas. They're very cheap. This one actually is a vintage. This is a vintage cake, a 2001 Shaguan. This is who knows who made it. It's a replica. It's a copy. So the difference in price is really evident when you look at them. This one's a lot more expensive than this one. And that's not because of the storage. That's because of the vintage. So you get a lot better deal for your money if you get the Purple Sky. And if you like wet stored tea, then you can buy a cake or a tong of this tea. We got a deal on tongs. So, but I would recommend at least just getting this set and learning about the difference between dry and wet storage. As you maybe long-term store some puer tea yourself, it'd be helpful for you to know this. Or as you get interested in drinking more aged puers, this is also something worth learning. So this storage set, is a wonderful way for you to learn about aged puer and about aging puer yourself if you are interested in long-term aging and drinking different types of storage, because you will come across these different types of tea as you explore aged puers from Hong Kong versus Malaysia versus Taiwan versus Kunming and other places. You will encounter dry versus wet storage. So understanding this both intellectually and experientially is important. And of course, all the proceeds from this set, whether you buy cakes or the set itself, will go to support Light Meets Life, your tea center, which we hope to build soon. Thank you so much for all your support that you have given and will give. Stay full of tea. Until the next video.